It's 4 a.m. I can't sleep, so why not make a little YouTube video? Let's talk about the kinematics of trauma in motor vehicle accidents. Injuries are relatively pretty predictable in MVAs, and they like to ask you questions about this kind of stuff on exams. In a frontal MVA, there are two pathways. There's the up and over pathway, where the person travels upwards. They strike the top of their head on the windshield, which causes axial loading injuries, skull fractures, and scalp injuries. They may also have chest injuries and maybe some abdominal trauma from striking the steering wheel. Expect to see sternal fractures, rib fractures, pulmonary contusions, blunt myocardial injury, all quite common. As far as blunt myocardial injury, keep in mind that the right ventricle is the most likely part of the heart to be injured because of its positioning in the chest and because it's not very muscular. Pneumothorax, very common, obviously because of the chest hitting the steering wheel at 80 miles per hour. What do people do before they crash? They go, which provides a nice vital capacity breath to fill the lungs with air and make them especially prone to injury. The next frontal collision pathway is the down and under. Abdominal trauma is common. Probably the most concerning thing that's going to happen abdominal wise is going to be a pelvic fracture or pelvic fractures. And as we know, pelvic fractures bleed. They go hand in hand with hemorrhagic shock. Also expect to find some gnarly lower extremity trauma as the legs are forced downward and under the dashboard. Lateral impacts are arguably the most dangerous type of collision. Expect to see ipsilateral injuries of the arm. As far as the chest, rib fractures, pneumothorax, hemothorax, all bad stuff. But what I really worry about in a legit lateral impact is aortic trauma. This little guy here is the ligamentum arteriosum, also known as Botello's ligament. And trivia point, this is where the ductus arteriosus was when you were a little fetus. This ligament anchors the aortic arch to the pulmonary artery. As you know, the aorta is the longest and biggest vessel in the body. In a lateral impact, the aorta wants to shift just like everything else in the chest, but it's anchored in place by this ligament and may shear with impact that is forceful enough. I think we're all familiar with rear end impacts. C-spine injuries, whiplash, ask any ambulance chasing personal injury attorney about this. Rollovers are not very predictable. Well, actually, they are if the occupants are wearing seatbelts. If they're wearing seatbelts, then rollovers tend to be pretty low ball and the occupants are very well protected, even at higher speeds and with dramatic vehicle damage. It's a different ballgame if they are not restrained. If they're not restrained, they tend to be high morbidity and mortality, and you don't know what kind of injuries you're going to find because people are getting jostled and thrown around, bumping into the inside of the car, bouncing off of each other, and maybe being ejected. As far as pedestrian struck accidents, lower extremity trauma, abdominal and chest trauma, and head injuries. Expect the injuries to be on the side of the car that was struck by the car. Duh. Keep in mind that adults tend to get struck on one side as they are crossing or running across the street. Kids are stupid and they tend to stop, turn, and face the oncoming car and freeze like a deer in headlights. There's this thing called Waddell's triad. You need to know it if you're going to take the FPC or CFRN exam. It is the pattern of injuries that can be expected when a child is struck by a car. Same side abdominal and lower extremity trauma with contralateral head injury from the kid getting propelled backwards and striking the back of their head on the road.